cost. The laws and the principles we collectively depend on to enable humanitarian assistance are now eroded to the point of becoming meaningless. Madam President, the humanitarian response in Gaza today is an illusion, a convenient illusion that perpetuates a narrative that this war is being waged in line with international laws. Calls for humanitarian assistance have echoed across this chamber, yet in Gaza we have less and less every day. Less space, less medicine, less food, less water, less safety. We no longer speak of a humanitarian scale-up. We speak of how to survive even without the bare minimum. Today in Gaza, efforts to provide assistance are haphazard, opportunistic, and entirely inadequate. How can we deliver life-saving aid in an environment where the distinction between civilians and combatants is disregarded? How can we sustain any type of response when medical workers are being targeted, attacked, and vilified for assisting the wounded? Madam President, attacks on healthcare are attacks on humanity. There is no health system to speak of left in Gaza. Israel's military has dismantled hospital after hospital. What remains is so little in the face of such carnage is preposterous. The excuse given is that medical facilities have been used for military purposes, yet we have seen no independently verified evidence of this. In exceptional circumstances where a hospital loses its protected status, any attack must follow the principles of proportionality and precaution. Instead of adhering to international law, we see the systematic disabling of hospitals. This has left the entire medical system inoperable. Since October the 7th, we have been forced to evacuate 9 different health facilities. 1 week ago, Nazar Hospital was raided. Medical staff were forced to leave despite repeated assurances that they could stay and continue caring for patients. These indiscriminate attacks, as well as the types of weapons and munitions used in densely populated areas, have killed tens of thousands and maimed thousands more. Our patients have catastrophic injuries, amputations, crushed limbs, and severe burns. They need sophisticated care. They need long and intensive rehabilitation. Medics cannot treat these injuries on a battlefield or in the ashes of destroyed hospitals. There are not enough hospital beds, there are not enough medications, and not enough supplies. Surgeons have had no choice but to carry out amputations without anesthesia on children. Our surgeons are running out of basic gauze to stop their patients from bleeding. They use it once, squeeze out the blood, wash it, sterilize it, and reuse it for the next patient. The humanitarian crisis in Gaza has left pregnant women without medical care for months. Women in labor cannot reach functional delivery rooms. They are giving birth in plastic tents and public buildings. Medical teams have added a new acronym to their vocabulary: WCNSF. Wounded child, no surviving family. Children who do survive this war will not only bear the visible wounds of traumatic injuries, but the invisible ones too. Those of repeated displacement, constant fear, and witnessing family members literally dismembered before their eyes. These psychological injuries have led children as young as 5 to tell us that they would prefer to die. The dangers for medical staff are enormous. On a daily basis, we are making the choice to continue working despite the increasing risks. We are scared. Our teams are beyond exhausted. Madam President, this must stop. We, along with the world, are closely watching how this Council and its members have approached the conflict in Gaza. Meeting after meeting, resolution after resolution, this body has failed to effectively address this conflict. We have watched members of this Council deliberate and delay while civilians die. We are appalled by the willingness of the United States to use its powers as a permanent Council member to obstruct efforts to adopt the most evident of resolutions, one demanding an immediate and sustained ceasefire. 3 times this Council has had an opportunity to vote for the ceasefire that is so desperately needed, and 3 times the United States has used its veto power, most recently this Tuesday. A new draft resolution by the United States ostensibly calls for a ceasefire. However, this is misleading at best. This Council should reject any resolution that further hampers humanitarian efforts on the ground and leads this Council to tacitly endorse the continued violence and mass atrocities in Gaza. The people of Gaza need a ceasefire not when practicable, but now. They need a sustained ceasefire, not a temporary period of calm. Anything short of this is gross negligence. The protection of civilians in Gaza cannot be contingent on resolutions from this Council which instrumentalise humanitarianism to blur political objectives. The protection of civilian infrastructure, of health workers and health facilities falls first and foremost on the parties to the conflict. But it is also a collective responsibility, a responsibility which rests with this Council and its members as parties to the Geneva Conventions. The consequences of casting international humanitarian law to the wind will reverberate well beyond Gaza. It will be an enduring burden on our collective conscience. This is not just political inaction, it has become political complicity. 2 days ago, MSF staff and families were attacked and died in a place they were told would be protected. Today, our staff are back at work, risking their lives once again for their patients. What are you willing to risk? We demand the protections promised under international humanitarian law. We demand a ceasefire from both parties. We demand the space to turn the illusion of aid to meaningful assistance. What will you do to make this happen? Thank you, Madam President.
I thank Mr. Lockyear for his briefing, and I will now give the floor to those Council members who wish to make statements. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Madam President, and thank you, Special Coordinator Wensland, for your briefing. Madam President, we all want to see a durable end to this conflict. The best way to advance an enduring peace and Israel's security is to support the creation of an independent Palestinian state side by side with Israel. The realization of this vision, however, continues to face numerous obstacles, several of which we have heard about in today's briefing by the Special Coordinator. These obstacles include Hamas and other groups' continued holding of 134 hostages. I've said it before, and I will say it again. There can be no sustainable ceasefire in Gaza without the hostages being released. After 5 months of fighting, this is clear. Colleagues, the pace of hostage talks can be frustrating. They are complicated by practical considerations, and as we all know, negotiations at such high stakes do not always yield immediate results. For this reason, we are working day in and day out with our partners in Egypt and Qatar to achieve a positive result that would bring the hostages home and result in a 6-week-long cessation in fighting. I also share your profound concern for the well-being of the more than 1 million Palestinian civilians in Rafah. President Biden and Secretary Blinken made clear to Israel that under current circumstances, a major ground offensive into Rafah would result in civilian harm and displacement, including potentially into neighboring countries, which would have serious implications for regional peace and security. As such, we have underscored that such a major ground offensive should not proceed under current circumstances. These statements are a clear signal. Israel should not proceed with an operation that we know will create more suffering and worsen the humanitarian crisis in the absence of a viable plan to protect civilians. We all want to see a durable end to this conflict, and there are 3 key elements I'd like to highlight. A temporary ceasefire conditioned on an agreement to release the hostages is the first step. Again, this is the best path forward. Protection of civilians. Again, we have communicated our concerns to Israel quite clearly. We need better deconfliction and coordination mechanisms so that humanitarian personnel can perform life-saving work, a point that was reinforced today by the Special Coordinator. We cannot forget that 1.5 million civilians in Rafah and other civilians across Gaza would not be in harm's way right now if Hamas abided by the laws of war, did not embed itself with civilians, did not hide in tunnel complexes beneath hospitals and schools, and did not engage in other atrocities. Hamas's violations of international humanitarian law and its abuses against the civilian population in Gaza also in no way lessen Israel's responsibility to do everything possible to protect the civilian population. And finally, full implementation of Senior Coordinator Cogg's plan to accelerate the delivery of humanitarian aid at scale. That includes opening additional crossings for delivery of aid and commercial goods and keeping currently available crossings open. Here, again, the United States has been clear with Israel about the need for urgent and specific steps to increase the throughput and consistency of humanitarian assistance. Colleagues, let me close by emphasizing what Ambassador Thomas Greenfield noted the other day. Namely, the United States stands ready and indeed has begun negotiations on a council product that supports diplomacy on the ground to bring about a sustainable end to this conflict. Moreover, the United States will continue to press the parties to reach a deal that would bring the hostages home and allow for an extended 6-week temporary ceasefire. Council support for this diplomacy is critical to increase pressure on Hamas to accept the agreement on the table. Securing that agreement and successfully implementing it is how we lay the foundation for a durable peace. This is critical for Palestinian civilians in Gaza whose family members have been killed, whose homes have been destroyed, who have been displaced multiple times, and who wonder where they'll find their next meal or when and where the next airstrike will land. It is critical for the families of hostages, mothers and relatives who don't know whether their children are alive, injured, or deceased. It is critical for Israelis, many of whom are still displaced or face barrages of rocket fire. It is critical for Palestinian civilians in the West Bank, who face record levels of violence by extremist settlers, violence that we unequivocally condemn. It is critical for humanitarian workers and journalists who put their lives on the line every day to do their jobs and to help us do ours, and must be protected. And it is critical to everyone who desperately wants to see sustainable peace in this region. We welcome the support of Council members for ongoing diplomacy and thank the UN for its ongoing efforts toward a sustainable end to this tragic conflict. Thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the United States for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the Russian Federation.
Госпожа председатель, благодарим докладчиков за объективные оценки катастрофической ситуации в секторе Газа. Особенно прямые, честные и леденящие душу свидетельства господина Lockyear. Что к этому еще можно добавить? Имеющие уши слышать да слышать. Госпожа председатель, сегодняшнее заседание проходит на фоне очередного вето Соединенных Штатов, наложенного на проект решения Совета Безопасности о немедленном прекращении огня в анклаве. Оправданий для таких действий американской делегации нет и быть не может. Беспрецедентное насилие в зоне Палестино-израильского конфликта продолжается без малого 140 дней. Колоссальные цифры потерь и разрушений, которые мы сегодня услышали от докладчиков, говорят сами за себя. Более 29 тысяч человек включая женщин и детей, стали жертвами неизбирательных бомбардировок и силовых действий израильских военных. По меньшей мере 69 тысяч человек получили ранения. И ужасающие ранения, как мы только что сегодня слышали. 80% всего населения сектора стали внутренне перемещенными лицами, большая часть из которых нашли убежище на юге анклава в городах Хан-Юнис и Рафах, которые находятся в фактической осаде. Израильские военно-воздушные силы их интенсивно бомбят. Фактически речь идет о целенаправленной политике Западного Иерусалима по выдавливанию палестинцев из Газы, последствия которой неизбежно приведут к тому, что газовитяне прорвут границу с Египтом, и гуманитарная катастрофа разольется по его территории. Так называемые дипломатические усилия Вашингтона на земле, про которые, как заклинание, твердят наши американские коллеги, ни к чему до сих пор не привели. Очевидно, что рычагов реального воздействия на правительство Израиля у Вашингтона попросту нет. Власти Западного Иерусалима безапелляционно заявляют, что зачистка анклава, дескать, продлится еще несколько месяцев. Выступая с призывами к продолжению военной операции, ликвидации присутствия в анклаве Бапор и насильственному перемещению палестинцев из мест их постоянного проживания. При этом также очевидно, что, несмотря на браваду, Израиль не достигает своих заявленных целей. Его военная операция, насколько можно судить по информации в открытом доступе, не помогает и не поможет освободить заложников. На этом фоне заявление представителя Соединенных Штатов о том, что прекращение огня не может быть без освобождения заложников, выглядит вдвойне цинично. Это освобождение заложников не может быть без прекращения огня. То есть мы имеем дело с патовой ситуацией неконтролируемой эскалации, жертвами которой становятся новые тысячи палестинцев. В Совете Безопасности фактически сложился консенсус по поводу необходимости остановить насилие. На пути многосторонних усилий под эгидой ООН стоит лишь одна делегация – Соединенные Штаты Америки. Выгораживая своего ближневосточного союзника, они пытаются продать под видом альтернативных решений благословение со стороны Совета Безопасности на развязки, которые выгодны одному Израилю, а точнее геополитическим интересам Соединенных Штатов на Ближнем Востоке. Все ООНовские структуры во главе с генеральным секретарем Гутерришем в один голос говорят о необходимости срочного гуманитарного прекращения огня в качестве обязательного условия налаживания гуманитарного содействия в необходимом масштабе и создания условий для освобождения заложников. Именно это требование к сторонам было краеугольным камнем подготовленной делегацией Алжира проекта резолюции, заветированного Соединенными Штатами. Коллеги, раз за разом, блокируя решение Совета Безопасности, да еще и пренебрежительно призывая его не мешать своей дипломатии, вы оказываете себе медвежью услугу. Вместо того, чтобы позволить Совету использовать имеющийся у него ресурс, надавить своим авторитетом, вы все больше теряете нити контроля над ситуацией, давая зеленый свет на продолжение агрессии против палестинского народа, в том числе на осуществление наземной операции в Рафахе. Тупиковая ситуация в Совете Безопасности, порожденная твердолобой позицией Соединенных Штатов, приводит к тому, что насилие из Газы уже распространилось на весь регион Ближнего Востока. Последствия мы видим в Сирии, Ливане, Ираке, Йемене. Сочувствие палестинцам естественным образом всколыхнуло Ближний Восток. При этом западные страны вместо поиска адекватного политического решения пытаются по традиции забомбить недовольных и несогласных. Применение силы англосаксонской коалиции против суверенных Сирии, Ирака и Йемена представляют прямую угрозу международному миру и безопасности. Подрывает миропорядок, основанный на верховенстве международного права и центральной роли Организации Объединенных Наций. Госпожа председатель, не просматривается даже малейшей перспективы прекращения гуманитарной катастрофы в Газе, порожденной продолжающейся военной операцией Израиля в анклаве и за его пределами. Ввиду отсутствия беспрепятственного гуманитарного доступа на территорию сектора, особенно в его северные районы, газовитяне страдают от голода и инфекционных заболеваний. В этих катастрофических условиях вызывает непонимание и возмущение решение ряда западных доноров приостановить финансирование БАПОР в связи с подозрением участия его сотрудников в сотрудничестве с ХАМАС. Которые были немедленно уволены до проведения какого-либо расследования лишь на основании обвинений Израиля. Призываем к пересмотру решения о приостановке финансирования БАПОР. Заочное наказание миллионов нуждающихся в помощи палестинцев попросту аморально и не может рассматриваться никак иначе, как проявление донорского шантажа и политизации гуманитарных вопросов. Ведь на деле это означает усугубление страданий палестинцев в Газе, в том числе из-за перебоев в оказании гуманитарной помощи, образовательных и социальных услуг, здравоохранения для порядка 6 миллионов палестинцев на всех оккупированных палестинских территориях, а также в Иордании, Сирии и Ливане. В этой связи осуждаем попытки дискредитировать агентство, навешивая политические ярлыки на его деятельность. Со своей стороны подтверждаем нашу принципиальную позицию. Этот многолетний, длящийся десятилетиями конфликт не имеет силового решения и может быть урегулирован исключительно политико-дипломатическими средствами в рамках формулы двух государств. Последовательно выступаем за гуманитарное прекращение огня как безальтернативные условия обеспечения беспрепятственного гуманитарного доступа ко всем нуждающим и безусловного освобождения всех заложников. Это императив, на который должны быть нацелены все усилия Совета Безопасности. Призываем прислушаться к голосу арабского, мусульманского мира, да и большей части международного сообщества, требующих прекратить страдания мирного населения в Газе и на Ближнем Востоке. Благодарю вас.
I thank the representative of the Russian Federation for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Malta.
Thank you, President. I also thank Special Coordinator Wennesland and Mr. Chris Lockyear from Médecins Sans Frontières for their frank briefings. Mr. Lockyear, sincere condolences for the loss of lives of your colleagues. Too many humanitarian workers and UN workers have perished in this conflict so far. I thank you also for your courageous decision to brief us at this critical time. At the outset, I underline the fact that any reprisals are unacceptable. As a Council, we must make this clear to all sides. Malta has repeatedly and unequivocally condemned the Hamas terror attacks of 7th October. We reiterate that the immediate and unconditional release of hostages must be a top priority. However, the scale of human suffering that continues to unfold in Gaza due to the ongoing hostilities is appalling and deeply consternating. We regret that 2 days ago this Council once again failed to call for a permanent ceasefire. The Israeli government's announcement that it will be advancing its ground offensive into Rafah is extremely alarming. This area, designated as a safe zone, is sheltering half the population of the Strip, including over 600,000 children and their families. We are gravely concerned at Israel's plan to displace this acutely vulnerable population. This will only serve to perpetuate the forced displacement of Palestinians and further inflame regional tensions. President, We have already heard this morning of the medical and humanitarian consequences of this relentless assault on Gaza. 30,000 people have already been killed as a result. 12,000 are children. Not a single medical facility remains fully functioning. Reports from the WFP and FAO attesting that acute malnutrition is causing signs of physical wasting in children under the age of 5 speaks volumes. Over 500,000 Gazans are in famine-like conditions due to the induced state of food insecurity. This humanitarian crisis in Gaza needs to be urgently addressed. Israel is required to facilitate the full and unimpeded delivery of humanitarian aid into Gaza, which continues to fall short, and to facilitate the effective humanitarian deconfliction mechanism. Further crossing points need to be reopened to allow adequate scaling up of aid, particularly in the north of Gaza, where conditions are reportedly even more dire. President, Malta calls for the full implementation of Security Council Resolutions 2712 and 2720. This remains the bare minimum required. In this vein, we fully support the Special Humanitarian Reconstruction Coordinator in her mandate. We also call for the immediate implementation of the Order on Provisional Measures issued by the International Court of Justice on 26 January. UNRWA's presence also remains essential. Funding cuts to the agency will cause immediate repercussions. It is in this vein that Malta has issued a further contribution to UNRWA, and we encourage others to do the same. President, in the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem, attacks by the IDF and violent settlers on unarmed Palestinians threaten to push the occupied territories over the brink. We unequivocally stress that settlements are in violation of international law, and their continued expansion must stop. Malta also remains deeply concerned about the escalation of hostilities across and beyond the Blue Line. We urge all concerned to stop this cycle of violence. De-escalation and restraint are critical. We reiterate that an immediate ceasefire in Gaza must be agreed to allow the necessary space for a diplomatic resolution to this conflict. This needs to include a revitalized Palestinian Authority, which has the agency and legitimacy to govern the people of an independent Palestine, including Gaza, in line with the two-state solution. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Malta for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Japan.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank Special Coordinator Venezuelan and Mr. Chris Lockyear, Secretary General of Medicine Sans Frontières, for their valuable briefings. Madam President, nearly 140 days have passed since Hamas and others abhorrent acts of terror against Israel took place. We reiterate our unequivocal condemnation of this heinous act and call for the immediate and unconditional release of all remaining hostages held by Hamas and other groups. 140 days of hostilities are also far too long to bear witness to. Reportedly, nearly 30,000 Palestinians have lost their lives, 75% of the population displaced, and estimated 70% of homes destroyed or damaged. Japan is deeply concerned about the Israeli military offensive into Rafah, where almost 1.5 million people are sheltering. The humanitarian situation in Gaza has been a nightmare for too long. It is also regrettable the World Food Programme has to pause food deliveries to northern Gaza despite widespread starvation and disease. To meet the enormous humanitarian requirements, more coordination between relevant parties is necessary. We also need more trucks and fuel inside Gaza to ensure consistent and predictable aid delivery. We urge Israel to open additional border crossings and secure humanitarian corridors so that the humanitarian actors can safely carry out their work. We strongly support the efforts of UN Senior Coordinator Ms. Sigrid Kaag to overcome the many impediments to reaching those in need. In this vein, Japan reiterates that the humanitarian ceasefire needs to be realized promptly in such a way as to ensure a conducive environment for sufficient humanitarian assistance activities, as well as to lead to release of remaining hostages, therefore resulting in the realization of a sustainable ceasefire. The Security Council was unable to adopt a resolution 2 days ago, but our collective endeavor must continue. We also express deep appreciation for the ongoing four-party diplomatic talks, hoping that they swiftly bear fruit. Madam President, the conflict is already spreading across the region, from Israeli settler violence in the West Bank, intensified hostilities between Hezbollah and Israel, and to provocative attacks against vessels by the Houthis in the Red Sea. We cannot afford a wider conflict which would reverberate around the world. All parties must abide by international law, including international humanitarian law, and observe in good faith relevant Security Council resolutions. Japan takes the allegations made against UNRWA seriously. At the same time, we also understand its services are vital to Palestinians across the region. We therefore hope the independent investigations now underway will be efficiently and swiftly concluded, and the agency will take appropriate measures, including strengthening its governance, in order to restore the trust of the international donors in a sustainable way and broaden donor bases. Japan will continue to work with other Council members toward regional stability. It is high time that we heed many calls to save lives, including from the ICJ, in its legally binding order on the provisional measures. To conclude, I would like to stress that de-escalation and the humanitarian ceasefire are prerequisite for the ultimate goal that we all wish to see, which is two independent states, Israel and Palestine, living side by side in peace and security. I thank Madam President.
I thank the representative of Japan for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Thank you, President, and thank you, Special Coordinator Wennesland, for your briefing today. Mr. Lockyear, I join others in offering condolences to the families and friends of those who have lost their lives, and also I salute the courage of those who have decided to stay. Your briefing to us was harrowing and your message was unequivocal and clear, and I thank you for that. Colleagues, we all know that Palestinian civilians are facing a devastating and growing humanitarian crisis in Gaza. We want the fighting to stop now. But simply calling for a ceasefire now doesn't make it happen, and it won't make it sustainable. That is why we're calling for an immediate suspension in fighting to get aid in and hostages out, and then progress towards a sustainable, permanent ceasefire, without a return to destruction, fighting, and death. That means the release of all hostages, the formation of a new Palestinian government for the West Bank and Gaza, accompanied by an international support package, removing Hamas' capability to launch attacks against Israel, Hamas no longer being in charge of Gaza, and a political horizon which provides a credible and irreversible pathway toward a two-state solution. Current negotiations are critical to secure the release of the hostages held in Gaza, as well as progress towards our shared objective of a sustainable ceasefire. The UK government continues to work intensively with partners across the region to support this, and we call on all actors to do the same. President, we are gravely concerned by the prospect of an Israeli offensive on Rafah, which would have disastrous consequences for the civilians sheltering there with nowhere else to go. Over half of Gaza's population are sheltering in the area, and the Rafah crossing is vital to ensure aid can reach the people who so desperately need it. That is why the immediate priority must be a suspension in fighting, which is the best route to secure the safe relief of hostages and significantly step up the aid reaching Gaza. We're also gravely concerned that the UN World Food Programme has had to pause deliveries of food aid to northern Gaza. We continue to stress the need for Israel to support the UN to distribute aid effectively across the whole of Gaza, including in the north, as the Special Coordinator referred to, and for Israel to open more crossing points into Gaza. Nitzana and Kerem Shalom must be open for longer. Israel must also ensure effective deconfliction in Gaza and take all possible measures to ensure the safety of medical personnel and facilities. As we approach Ramadan, we urge all parties to call for calm and not inflame tensions around the holy sites. We call on everyone to respect their sanctity and security. Now, more than ever, we need to generate momentum towards a permanent peace, and the UK will continue to work intensively in support of a two-state solution which guarantees justice, peace and security for the people of two states, Israel and Palestine. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Merci Madame la Présidente. Et comme mes collègues, je voudrais remercier le coordinateur spécial Torvald Nesland et Chris Lockyear de leur présentation qui ne peuvent nous laisser indifférents. Nous sommes consternés par les récentes attaques à Al-Mawazi où des membres de famille du staff de Médecins sans frontières ont été tués. Ces victimes s'ajoutent au nombre croissant de victimes que nous avons à déplorer. J'exprime mes très sincères condoléances aux proches de toutes les victimes et à votre organisation, et j'exprime aussi mon admiration pour tous les humanitaires qui restent sur place pour travailler malgré les circonstances. Il est de notre devoir, en tant que membres de ce Conseil, de réaffirmer notre attachement au principe d'humanité, qui est aujourd'hui sévèrement mis à l'épreuve au Moyen-Orient. Ce principe sous-tend les règles du droit international, en particulier du droit international humanitaire et des droits humains, et nous relie dans notre essence commune. Nous regrettons donc la non-adoption d'une résolution appelant à la mise en place immédiate d'un cessez-le-feu humanitaire. Aujourd'hui, on l'a entendu, dans la bande de Gaza, plus de 75% de la population est déplacée. Des centaines de milliers de civils sont assiégés et font face à la famine et aux épidémies. La plupart à Rafah, refuge pour plus d'1 million de civils fuyant les combats et un conduit vital pour l'aide humanitaire à Gaza. La Suisse est profondément préoccupée par les conséquences humanitaires catastrophiques que pourrait avoir une large offensive militaire d'Israël à Rafah, tant directement pour la population civile que pour l'acheminement de l'aide humanitaire. Nous condamnons le fait que les hostilités continuent de faire de nombreuses victimes parmi les civils à Gaza. Nous comptons aujourd'hui près de 30 000 personnes tuées, dont une majorité de femmes et enfants. En 4 mois, les bombardements répétés de zones urbaines densément peuplées ont détruit 70% des infrastructures civiles à Gaza. Nous réitérons aussi notre ferme condamnation des actes de terreur et des attaques indiscriminées du Hamas dès le 7 octobre et nos appels répétés à la libération immédiate et inconditionnelle des otages. Le droit international humanitaire interdit les prises d'otages et exige à ce que les personnes hors de combat, qu'elles soient détenues, blessées ou malades, soient traitées avec humanité. La Suisse appelle toutes les parties au conflit, conformément à l'article 1 commun aux conventions de Genève, au strict respect du droit international humanitaire et à prendre les mesures concrètes pour épargner et protéger la population civile. Cela comprend notamment les principes fondamentaux de distinction, de proportionnalité et de précaution dans la conduite des hostilités. Dans ce sens, la Suisse rappelle également que les tirs de roquettes indiscriminés sont interdits par le droit international humanitaire. Il est important de réitérer que les unités sanitaires, telles que les hôpitaux, doivent être respectées et protégées en toutes circonstances. Elles bénéficient d'une protection spéciale sous les conventions de Genève, article 20. Elles ne doivent pas faire l'objet d'attaques ni être utilisées en dehors de leurs fonctions humanitaires pour commettre des actes nuisibles à l'ennemi. Nous sommes profondément préoccupés par les conséquences de l'effondrement du système de santé dans la bande de Gaza sur les civils, dont près de 70 000 personnes blessées. Selon l'article 55 de la 4e Convention de Genève, je cite, « La puissance occupante a le devoir d'assurer l'approvisionnement de la population en vivres et en produits médicaux. Cela doit être fait maintenant. » À cet égard, la Cour internationale de justice a été claire. Israël doit prendre sans délai des mesures effectives pour permettre la fourniture dans toute la bande de Gaza des services de base et de l'aide humanitaire requise de toute urgence. La Suisse rappelle à Israël qu'il doit se conformer à l'ordonnance de la Cour et prendre notamment les mesures nécessaires en ce sens. Nous l'avons entendu, les opérations d'aide humanitaire déjà fragilisées ne peuvent être maintenues à flot sans garantie de sécurité adéquate et sans accès suffisant pour le personnel humanitaire. À court terme, nous ne voyons pas d'alternative à l'UNRWA pour sauver des vies, offrir un abri et organiser l'assistance aux civils à Gaza. À la suite des accusations graves dont certains employés de l'UNRWA font l'objet, nous attendons des enquêtes indépendantes, qu'elles jettent toute la lumière sur ces allégations et appelons à toute coopération nécessaire à cette fin. Madame la Présidente, nous devons travailler dès maintenant à la protection des civils déplacés à l'intérieur de la bande de Gaza. Celle-ci doit faire partie intégrante du futur État palestinien vivant côte à côte avec Israël en paix et en sécurité. La Suisse reste à disposition pour soutenir les efforts diplomatiques sur le terrain. Un cessez-le-feu humanitaire à Gaza est nécessaire, aussi pour parvenir le plus rapidement possible à une désescalade au niveau régional. Nous nous tenons prêts à coopérer avec tous les membres du Conseil pour trouver un consensus à la recherche d'une solution qui puisse mettre fin à la souffrance humaine et relancer les perspectives de paix. Je vous remercie.
I thank the representative of Switzerland for her statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of China.
谢谢主席女士。主席女士，我感谢两位通报人刚才所做的通报。Lockyear 先生刚才所做的通报让人印象深刻。我希望他所描述的加沙悲惨景象，能让个别安理会成员产生良心上的触动。2天前，由于美国行使否决，安理会再一次错失了推动在加沙停火的机会。冲突每持续1天，就意味着更多的平民伤亡，也意味着更大的灾难。实现加沙立即停火，是拯救无辜生命的迫切要求，是防止更大规模战争的迫切要求。立即停火是国际社会的普遍呼声，也是安理会成员的压倒性共识。我们注意到美国提出了新的决议草案，希望美方秉持负责任的态度，顺应国际社会呼声，尊重安理会成员的既有共识。需要指出的是，安理会行动的核心必须是立即实现停火，有关信号必须明确、清晰、无误，而不是躲躲闪闪、遮遮掩掩。安理会此时需要的是 强大的决心，而不只是谈判技巧。主席女士，加沙冲突爆发已经4个多月，在更大灾难之前踩下刹车，是安理会必须承担的责任。必须立即停止对拉法的军事进攻。150多万加沙民众被迫聚集在拉法，以色列升级对拉法军事进攻，将造成难以想象的平民伤亡和人道灾难，对地区和平造成无法挽回的破坏。我们对此坚决反对。以色列应该立即取消对拉法的进攻计划，停止对巴勒斯坦人民的集体惩罚。国际法院要求防止种族灭绝的临时措施命令必须立即得到有效的执行。必须确保充足的人道援助不受阻碍地进入加沙。正如世界卫生组织总干事所言，加沙正在变成死亡地带，数以百万计的加沙民众缺乏基本生存物资，在饥饿、疾病和绝望中挣扎。与此同时，人道救援却因为人为障碍难以开展，到了难以为继的程度。世界粮食计划组已宣布因安全威胁，被迫暂停向加沙北部提供援助。当前，安理会第2712号、2720号决议必须得到全面落实。以色列必须采取切实行动，开放进入加沙的全部陆海空通道，为人道机构开展救援提供必要的条件，确保人道救援机构的人员、设施的安全。联合国近东巴勒斯坦难民救济和工程处为缓解加沙人道灾难发挥着不可或缺、无法替代的重要作用。我们呼吁有关供资国切实从人道主义出发，尽快恢复向工程处供资，维系加沙民众的生命线。各方应全力支持联合国加沙人道和重建高级协调员卡格女士的工作。必须全力防止冲突外溢。当前中东地区动荡不安，黎以、叙以交火升级，红海紧张局势持续，更大范围战乱的阴影笼罩在中东上空。我们呼吁各方，特别是有重要影响的国家，保持冷静克制，避免采取加剧紧张局势的行为。各方要努力用和平消弭战争，打破以暴制暴、冲突往返的恶性循环。必须重振两国方案的政治前景，建立独立的巴勒斯坦国，不是谁送给谁的礼物，而是巴勒斯坦人民不可剥夺的民族权利。以色列一些政治人物近期多次公开拒绝两国方案，拒绝任何实现巴勒斯坦独立建国的国际努力，我们对此表示严重关切。加沙是巴勒斯坦不可分割的一部分，两国方案是国际正义的底线，是解决巴以问题的唯一可行出路。中方敦促以色列立即停止侵蚀两国方案基础，停止针对巴勒斯坦民众的强制转移，停止在约旦河西岸的搜查、抓捕和袭击。巴勒斯坦遭受的历史不公必须得到纠正，巴勒斯坦独立建国的夙愿 必须得到实现。中方支持巴勒斯坦尽快成为联合国会员国，呼吁召开更大规模、更具权威、更有实效的国际和会，推动巴勒斯坦问题全面、公正、持久解决。谢谢主席。
I thank the representative of China for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of France.
Madame la Présidente, je remercie messieurs Wennesland et Lockyear pour leurs exposés. Comme l'a dit le président de la République, Emmanuel Macron, il est essentiel de conclure sans plus de délai un accord sur un cessez-le-feu à Gaza qui garantisse la protection de tous les civils. Le bilan humain et la situation humanitaire sont catastrophiques. Il est vital d'acheminer massivement l'aide à la population de Gaza. À cet égard, il est impératif d'ouvrir le port d'Ashdod, une voie terrestre directe depuis la Jordanie et tous les points d'accès à l'enclave. Il faut aussi tout faire pour faciliter le travail de la coordonnatrice spéciale Sigrid Kaag. Les opérations militaires israéliennes doivent cesser. La France s'oppose fermement à une offensive israélienne à Rafah qui ne pourrait qu'aggraver la tragédie en cours. Israël doit se conformer au droit international humanitaire qui impose en tout temps, en tout lieu, des principes clairs de distinction, de nécessité, de proportionnalité et de précaution. La France s'oppose aussi à tout déplacement forcé de population. Cela constituerait une violation du droit international humanitaire et ferait peser un risque supplémentaire d'escalade régionale. La France rappelle que tous les otages doivent être libérés immédiatement et sans condition, comme l'exigent les résolutions 2712 et 2720. Ce Conseil doit en faire une priorité. Il doit aussi condamner enfin les attaques terroristes du 7 octobre commises par le Hamas et d'autres groupes terroristes. La France rappelle son attachement indéfectible à la sécurité d'Israël et sa solidarité avec le peuple israélien après ces attaques terroristes. Les informations sur une participation d'agents de l'UNRWA aux attaques du 7 octobre sont d'une extrême gravité. Et la France salue les décisions prises immédiatement par le secrétaire général des Nations Unies pour faire la lumière sur ces allégations, notamment les 2 audits en cours. Il est essentiel de restaurer un horizon politique et de travailler à l'édification d'un État pour les Palestiniens et à la mise en place de garanties de sécurité pour Israël. La solution des 2 États est la seule qui puisse permettre de construire une paix juste et durable. Celle-ci est gravement menacée, notamment par la politique illégale de colonisation menée par Israël. En plus d'être un obstacle majeur à une paix durable, cette politique est un facteur de violence sur le terrain, commise en particulier par des colons. La France a adopté des sanctions à l'encontre de 28 d'entre eux. Israël doit garantir la sécurité des populations palestiniennes dans les territoires qu'il occupe. Il est enfin urgent d'éviter un embrasement régional. La stabilité du Liban et de toute la région nécessite le plein respect de la résolution 1701 par toutes les parties et avec l'aide de la FINUL. La France œuvre activement à une désescalade dans ce cadre. Elle continuera aussi à contribuer à la sécurité maritime en mer Rouge. La France plaide pour une mobilisation de ce Conseil sur l'ensemble des volets de la crise, sécuritaire, humanitaire, mais aussi politique. Je vous remercie.
I thank the representative of France for his statement, and I give the floor now to the representative of Ecuador.
Gracias, señora presidenta. Inicio agradeciendo al coordinador especial para el proceso de paz en Medio Oriente, Thor Wennesland, así como al señor Chris Lockyear, por sus intervenciones esta mañana. En los últimos meses, el ítem de agenda que hoy nos convoca, la situación en Medio Oriente, incluida la cuestión palestina, ha sido el más activo del Consejo de Seguridad. No es para menos. La situación, sin duda, así lo amerita. En este tiempo se han producido miles de dolorosas e inaceptables muertes de civiles inocentes. El Ecuador ha expresado su solidaridad con Israel y con Palestina porque valora por igual sus vidas, porque comparte el dolor de cada muerte innecesaria. La situación en Rafah hace indispensable recordar que las disposiciones del derecho internacional humanitario deben ser respetadas en todo momento y por todos. No son de acatamiento voluntario y su incumplimiento conlleva graves responsabilidades. Este Consejo ha adoptado 2 resoluciones, fruto de arduas negociaciones con el propósito de aliviar las condiciones que enfrenta la población civil en Gaza, en especial las mujeres y niños que constituyen la mayoría de las víctimas. El Ecuador demanda la completa implementación de las resoluciones 2712 y 2720 y para el efecto considera necesario un alto al fuego humanitario. Lo hemos expresado así en repetidas ocasiones y hoy lo volvemos a hacer. Asimismo, el Ecuador reitera su condena inequívoca de los ataques terroristas perpetrados por Hamas a partir del 7 de octubre y demanda nuevamente la liberación inmediata e incondicional de todos los rehenes. Señora Presidenta, en diciembre pasado, el coordinador Wendesland se dirigió a este Consejo y nos recordó que durante los primeros 9 meses del año pasado la situación del Consejo se centró en Cisjordania. Lo que sucede en Gaza no debe conducirnos a ignorar lo que sigue sucediendo en esa región. Las actividades de asentamiento, la crisis económica y los actos de violencia persisten. Constantemente somos testigos de los actos y declaraciones que provocan de provocación e incitación. Los comportamientos y declaraciones de los líderes tienen influencia en acciones de otras personas. Por esto, llamamos a que demuestren responsabilidad, moderación y un genuino compromiso para evitar una expansión mayor de las violencias. Hoy debemos realizar un particular llamado a la prudencia durante el sensible periodo de las festividades sagradas que se aproxima. Llamamos especialmente a respetar el status quo de los lugares santos de Jerusalén y el papel del Reino de Jordania como su custodio. Actos de provocación en estos lugares deben evitarse a toda costa. Finalmente, señora Presidenta, reiteramos una vez más nuestra convicción de que la única manera de terminar con este conflicto es a través de una solución pacífica, negociada, definitiva y justa para las partes, con existencia de 2 estados, Palestina e Israel, sobre la base de las fronteras de 1967 y de las resoluciones relevantes. Muchas gracias.
I thank the representative of Ecuador for his statement, and I give the floor now to the representative of Slovenia.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I want to thank the Special Coordinator, Wendesland, for his briefing. I also want to thank Mr. Lockyear for his very powerful testimony today, and I join others in expressing our support, admiration, and the condolences, of course, for loss of your staff. The Security Council meets today as a threat of incomprehensible proportions is looming over Rafah. I cannot but feel this unimaginable catastrophe is looming also over the Security Council, which has not been able yet to rally behind the call for a ceasefire and for silencing the skies over Gaza and Israel. What future is waiting for us, the international community, if we continue to be indifferent to the tears of 17,000 unaccompanied minors having witnessed unimaginable horrors of death and destruction? What kind of the Council have we become if we remain untouched by the tearful briefing that we heard today by the Secretary General of Médecins Sans Frontières? What is the future of the international community if the most fundamental principles of the international system and international humanitarian law, decades in the making, are crumbling in front of our eyes? I want to reiterate our deep concern over the grave violations of international humanitarian law and human rights law that we continue to witness in Gaza. From indiscriminate bombings, forced displacement, targeting of protected buildings and personnel, including hospitals and medical and humanitarian staff, to preventing the delivery of much-needed humanitarian aid to the people in Gaza, including water, food, fuel, and medicine supplies. Among violations, we consider with the same gravity also taking civilian hostages, preventing ICRC to get in touch with them, and preventing delivery of medicines they urgently need. I would like to take this opportunity to reiterate once again our distress over the working conditions, safety and security of medical and humanitarian personnel and UN staff in Gaza. Stories of hospital sieges and convoys, ambulances crews, and shelters being attacked are horrifying. We applaud the courage of humanitarian, medical and UN workers and organizations and their dedication to saving lives. Slovenia has assumed its share of responsibility to alleviate the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Just today, the government of Slovenia made additional contribution to UNRWA and is committed to providing further support in the future. Tomorrow, in cooperation with Jordan, Slovenia will provide a substantial amount of in-kind assistance to Gaza. Meanwhile, the violations of international humanitarian laws are continuing unchallenged, and they are weakening the power and sanctity of the rules of war, 75 years of which we are going to mark later this year. What consequences will these violations have for the safety of humanitarian and medical personnel in other and future conflicts? Madam President, it has been almost 4 weeks since the ICJ order on provisional measures. It is alarming that we have not seen a change in the way military operations are carried out. On the contrary, there is a continuing threat of an imminent Israeli ground invasion of Rafah, where massive civilian casualties are imminent. We are urging the Israeli government to restrain itself from carrying out such plans. We are condemning the statements and plans proposing mass displacement of Palestinians from Gaza and strongly reject them. To be clear, any displacement of the Palestinian population from Gaza could constitute another grave breach of international human rights law and international humanitarian law. Like we did 2 days ago and on every occasion in this Council, I would like to put on record our clear condemnation of the horrific Hamas attack on 7 October 23 and call for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. We remain hopeful about the negotiation process led by Egypt, Qatar and the United States, and we thank them for their role. We expect both parties to engage in negotiations in a meaningful way and conclude them now. We have been discussing regional spillover since the start of this conflict. The messages of many countries and citizens have been clearer and sharper recent weeks. We fear this conflict is spiraling out of control. We are observing gradually deteriorating conditions in the West Bank, along the Blue Line, in the Red Sea, but also in Syria and wider. Every conflict situation in the Middle East has its own root causes and its own spoilers. But nobody can deny that a ceasefire in Gaza would have a calming effect on the rest of the region. Only political solutions can bring peace and security to the whole region, and it is the responsibility of this Council to pave the way for them. The pathway to peace and to the two-state solution can only be built on an inclusive political process with a vision for the future. Slovenia continues calling for an international peace conference to address a two-state solution in a comprehensive manner. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Slovenia for his statement, and I give the floor now to the representative of Sierra Leone.
Madam President, I thank Mr. Tor Wennesland, Special Coordinator for the Middle East Peace Process, and Mr. Christopher Lockyear, Secretary General, Médecins Sans Frontières, for their timely, comprehensive, but also sobering briefings. The situation in the Middle East, with specific reference to the Palestine question, is marked by a cycle of insecurity and instability due to the unresolved ongoing occupation of the Palestinian territories. This fragility has been recently exacerbated by the 7th October 2023 attack by Hamas on Israeli civilians, which we strongly condemn. Regrettably, the current war in the Gaza Strip, which has ensued, continues to rage, causing grievous harm to civilians. The war in Gaza has also threatened stability in the Middle East region. The severity of the situation at this stage is an indication that what should be foremost amongst our priorities as a Council is focusing on ending the war in Gaza and ensuring the release of all hostages held by Hamas and other armed groups. Sierra Leone remains deeply concerned that Resolutions 2712 and 2720 adopted by this Council have not been fully implemented. We remain deeply concerned about the parties to the conflict consistent failure to comply with international law, particularly international humanitarian law. We are gravely concerned about the failure to protect civilians, civilian objects, and humanitarian workers. The reported figures of casualties among civilians and humanitarian workers across the Gaza Strip since the 7th October 2023 attack are deeply disturbing. It is distressing to note that over 29,000 fatalities have been recorded, a greater percentage being women and children. According to UNICEF, this does not include the 1 million children in need of mental health and psychosocial support, and the 17,000 children unaccompanied or separated from their parents. Our deep concern about the destruction of civilian infrastructure extends to acts of perfidy and military operations being executed in healthcare facilities, including the Nasser Hospital Complex in Khan Yunis. Such actions pose threats to patients and medical personnel obligated to be protected under international humanitarian law. We recognize the bravery and commitment displayed by United Nations personnel and a host of other humanitarian and medical workers who endeavor daily to provide life-saving aid to civilians in need amidst ongoing hostilities in Gaza. To the relatives and friends of all those who have lost their lives since the start of the conflict, we express our deepest condolences. This Council, however, can offer more than condolences and deep concerns. This Council is mandated to do more. The collective security scheme and the responsibility that accompanies it behoves this Council to do more. As we stated 2 days ago, we are deeply worried that over 140 days now, 130 days in the conflict in Gaza then, the Security Council was unable to adopt another resolution, even with 13 affirmative votes. The resolution would have called for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire, demanding the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages, rejecting forced displacement of the Palestinians, reiterating the call for full, rapid, safe, and unhindered humanitarian access in Gaza, and the optimal political solution of a two-state solution, which could not be adopted. Madam President, the situation in the wider Middle East region is becoming increasingly volatile as a result of the grave situation currently unfolding in the Gaza Strip. The fallout from the Gaza conflict is being felt throughout the Middle East and beyond. The reported incident of air raids and firing of rockets in southern Lebanon and northern Israel, respectively, is deeply concerning. The continuing maritime attacks in the Red Sea by the Houthis in Yemen must stop. Responses to the Houthis' attack must also comply with international law. The relevant resolutions of the Security Council must be respected. Given this situation, Sierra Leone has the following observations and immediate action points. Firstly, the ongoing bombardment and imminent intense military operations in the Gaza Strip, with a spotlight on the impending attack on Rafah City, will further worsen the current humanitarian situation being endured by civilians who cannot access basic essentials like water, food, electricity, and medical supplies. Therefore, we emphasize the need for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. the Security Council is primarily responsible for the maintenance of international peace and security, and thus we expect this Council to adopt a resolution that unambiguously calls for a humanitarian ceasefire. Secondly, we acknowledge the ongoing diplomatic negotiations being mediated by the United States, Egypt, and Qatar, and we sincerely look forward to having a positive outcome. The ongoing diplomatic negotiations done in good faith can complement or be complemented by a Security Council resolution that demands a full and unconditional humanitarian ceasefire and the release of all of the hostages unconditionally. Thirdly, we call on parties to the conflict to respect and comply with the 26 January 2024 order of the International Court of Justice to, inter alia, enable the provision of urgently needed basic services and humanitarian assistance to address the adverse conditions of life faced by Palestinians in the Gaza Strip. Fourthly, we urge Israeli settlers and Palestinians in the West Bank and other actors in the wider region to refrain from any unilateral or provocative action or activity with the potential to inflame further tensions. In closing, Madam President, Sierra Leone regrets the serious allegations based on information provided by Israel implicating 12 UNRWA staff members in the 7 October 2023 attacks in Israel. We welcome the swift action by the United Nations and the immediate activation of the investigation by the UN Office of Internal Oversight Services. We urge for a comprehensive and speedy conduct of the investigations and urge all relevant parties to comply with the investigators and cooperate with them. Sierra Leone acknowledges the pivotal role played by UNRWA in providing humanitarian assistance to the 1.9 internally displaced Palestinians in the Gaza Strip, but also to Palestinians in the West Bank, Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon. We therefore reiterate our call for the continuation of vital funding to facilitate UNRWA's indispensable operations. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Sierra Leone for his statement, and I give the floor now to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Madam President. I thank Special Coordinator Tor Wensland for detailed briefing and Secretary General of MSF, Christopher Lockyear, for a vivid testimony that I believe touched member states in this room. The current catastrophe in Gaza started in the fall of last year, and we are now heading toward spring. For a period of more than 4 months, civilians in Gaza have suffered excessively, experienced the worst winter without adequate shelter, food, and clothes. The number of facilities in Gaza, 70% of whom are women and children, is outrageous. This tragic situation must come to an end. Over the last 2 weeks, the world has been gravely concerned of possible ground operations in Rafah, where more than half of the Gazan population is densely packed, seeking safety and security for themselves and their children. Extensive military operations in Rafah will lead to another great calamity. This must not happen. And any forcible transfer of Palestinians outside Palestine, including the Gaza Strip, is simply not acceptable. Madam President, Ramadan, the holy month for Muslims, is fast approaching. Yet the situation in Gaza has seen little improvement. Indeed, more than 70% of civil infrastructures, such as homes, schools, and hospitals in Gaza, are now completely destroyed or badly damaged. More than 1 million children are in need of mental health support, and 17,000 children are reported to have been orphaned. 2.2 million people, almost everyone in Gaza, are at imminent risk of famine. All these figures are hard to believe, but tragically, these difficult facts tell the ongoing reality for Gaza and its people. Yet we must not forget that the Israeli citizens are also suffering. More than 100 hostages are still being held in Gaza, and their family members are desperately waiting for any news of their beloved ones. Hamas and other militant groups are still firing rockets from Gaza into Israel. At the same time, regional tensions are expanding, bringing imminent danger of greater conflagration. The Blue Line between Israel and Lebanon is facing a constant risk of further intensification of the current armed conflict. And the attacks against vessels on the Red Sea by the Houthis are ongoing. All across the Middle East, including in Iraq and Syria, instability and tensions are at an alarming level. All actors in the region should pursue de-escalation, considering the combustible moment we collectively face. To stop the atrocities in Gaza and Israel, and to ease the perilous tensions in the region, we once again call for a humanitarian ceasefire in Gaza. The terrorist attacks by Hamas on the 7th of October must be resolutely condemned. But Israel's right and duty to protect itself and its citizens must be carried out in full compliance with international law, including international humanitarian law. Madam President, the Republic of Korea supports every effort to achieve a cessation of hostilities. Thus, we voted in favor earlier this week of the resolution calling for a humanitarian ceasefire. Korea also appreciates the efforts being undertaken by key stakeholders in the region, including Egypt, Qatar, and the United States to this end. Korea hopes that the hostilities will soon end. However, we are also deeply worried that even after the current situation ends, agony and sorrow will be deeply rooted in both Palestine and Israel, bearing a high risk of relapse. As such, it is high time for the international community, notably the Security Council, to realize the two-state solution, which is the only viable way toward a brighter future, underpinned with peace, security, prosperity, and the dignity for all. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for his statement, and I give the floor now to the representative of Mozambique.
Madam President, Mozambique thanks the Guyana Presidency for convening this briefing on the situation in the Middle East, including the Palestinian question. We extend our deep appreciation to Mr. Tor Wennesland, Special Coordinator for Middle East Peace Process, for his briefing and for important work he and his team have been doing at this difficult hour. We are grateful to Mr. Christopher Lockyear, Director General of the Médecins Sans Frontières, for his insight update to the Council. Madam President, the ongoing crisis in Gaza continues to be a matter of great concern to the international community as a whole. The situation is dire, with humanitarian needs escalating rapidly. The escalation of hostilities has been killing people and causing devastating consequences on critical civilian infrastructure, aggravating the humanitarian crisis that affect particularly women and children. Facilitating secure and unimpeded humanitarian access across Gaza is crucial in order to save millions of lives, since people depend exclusively on humanitarian assistance. Efforts to address the crisis in Gaza Strip have not been successful so far. Full implementations of Security Council resolutions will constitute a step in the right direction. In this context, Mozambique defends the following actions. 1. An immediate and urgent humanitarian ceasefire, a cessation of hostilities followed by permanent ceasefire. This is important to ensure that humanitarian aid is delivered without restriction to those in need in Gaza. Second, strict observance of and full respect for international humanitarian law and international human rights law aimed at saving innocent civilian populations. And finally, we renew our call for an urgent implementation of two-state solution for Israel and Palestine, with both living side by side as good neighbors in accordance with the UN Charter, Security Council, and the General Assembly resolutions. I thank you, Madam President.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for his statement, and I give the floor to the representative of Algeria.
السيد الرئيس، أود أن أتقدم بداية بالشكر لكل من السيد تور وينسلاند والسيد كريس لوكير على مداخلتهما الوافيتين، كما أقدم تعازينا لأرواح العاملين الإنسانيين للأمسف الذين سقطوا خلال تأديتهم لمهامهم النبيلة. نجتمع اليوم والعدوان على الشعب الفلسطيني تجاوز يومه 140 ولا تزال دار لقمان على حالها. صور الخراب والدمار تعم أرجاء قطاع غزة المحاصر، والاعتداءات من قبل المستوطنين وقوات الاحتلال تتزايد في الضفة الغربية والقدس الشريف، والعالم بما فيه مجلس الأمن يقف عاجزا عن وقف آلة قتل همجية اعتادت العربدة من دون حسيب ولا رقيب. ونؤكد أنه وهم من يعتقد أنه بإمكانه إخماد جدوى الرغبة في التحرر والانعتاق بالحديد والنار، ووهم من يظن أن بناء المستوطنات بالضفة والقدس الشريف وغرس المستوطنين بهما وتغولهم على الفلسطينيين اليوم سيفت في عظظهم ويقتل آمالهم في إقامة دولتهم. ومثل ما أكده رئيس الجمهورية السيد عبد المجيد تبون وأقتبس: إن نفس إرادة الحياة والتحرر لا يمكن وأدها بفظائع القصف وبشاعة التدمير وخطط التهجير الإجباري وسيناريوهات التطهير العرقي التي يتمادى فيها الاحتلال الصهيوني ضد أشقائنا في فلسطين المحتلة، وبجرائم الإبادة وجرائم الحرب التي يستمر في ارتكابها في قطاع غزة، والتي سيكتب التاريخ كل من يقف وراءها في عداد مجرمي الحرب وأعداء الحياة والإنسانية. نهاية الاقتباس. سيد الرئيس، إن الأوضاع بغزة على شفا الانهيار، وما قرار برنامج الأغذية العالمي وقف عملياته بشمال القطاع إلا دليل آخر على المصير المحتوم الذي ينتظر حوالي 300,000 شخص لا يجدون ما يسد رمقهم، حيث نجدد مطلبنا بوقف فوري ودائم لإطلاق النار لوضع حد لهذه المأساة الإنسانية. إنه مطلب أضحى ضرورة ملحة ومستعجلة اليوم مع تفاقم الأوضاع وتدهورها. كما نجدد دعمنا للأونروا ولكل وكالات الأمم المتحدة والعاملين الإنسانيين في وجه الحملات المغرضة التي تستهدفهم. إنها محاولات بائسة تحاول أن تهدم أسباب صمود الفلسطينيين على أرضهم. كما أن التلويح بمهاجمة رفح ومنع دخول المساعدات بحجج وهمية إمعانا في الانتقاص من كرامة الفلسطينيين ودفعهم لمغادرة أراضيهم مرفوضة وغير مقبولة تماما. نؤكد مرة أخرى رفضنا لأي مخطط يستهدف التهجير القسري للفلسطينيين. كما نحذر من مخاطر الإجراءات المتخذة للحد من وصول الفلسطينيين للمسجد الأقصى خلال شهر رمضان المبارك. إنها إجراءات تهدد بإشعال الوضع أكثر وخروجه عن السيطرة. ونؤكد على ضرورة احترام الوضع القانوني والتاريخي بالمسجد الأقصى المبارك، وعلى دور الوصاية الهاشمية الأردنية على المقدسات الإسلامية والمسيحية، وأن المسجد الأقصى بكل مساحته المقدرة ب 144 دنم هي مكان عبادة خالصة للمسلمين. كما نجدد رفضنا لمخططات التقسيم الزماني والمكاني للأقصى المبارك. سيد الرئيس، إنه لا حل للقضية الفلسطينية إلا بإقامة الدولة الفلسطينية وتمكين الشعب الفلسطيني من جميع حقوقه المشروعة وغير القابلة للتصرف. أود أن أختم بما جاء في رسالة رئيس الجمهورية السيد عبد المجيد تبون بمناسبة اليوم العالمي للتضامن مع الشعب الفلسطيني، وأقتبس: إن الجزائر التي دفعت الثمن غاليا لاستعادة سيادتها واستقلالها، والتي كانت أرضها شاهدة على إعلان قيام الدولة الفلسطينية قبل 35 سنة، ستبقى على العهد داعمة لقضايا التحرر، ولن تألو جهدا في دعم صمود الشعب الفلسطيني حتى ينال حقوقه كاملة غير منقوصة. نهاية الاقتباس. شكرا سيدة الرئيس.
I thank the representative of Algeria for his statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Guyana. I thank Special Coordinator Wenslin for his very sobering briefing, which presented the grim realities on the ground. I thank you, Mr. Lockyear, for your frankness, even in the face of possible reprisals. We also offer our condolences on the loss of the lives of your colleagues, and we salute the bravery of those who continue to operate, bringing service to Gaza in these very trying times. Guyana is deeply, deeply disturbed that this Council has been unable to unite to secure relief for the Palestinian people, from a war relentless in scope and scale, and which has driven the population of Gaza to unprecedented levels of desperation and loss. The blatant disregard for international law, including for obligations stemming from international instruments to which the occupying power is party, is wholly unacceptable. Equally unacceptable is the manner in which words have been toyed with on this Council to deny the Palestinians what they so desperately need at this time, a ceasefire. And all of this amidst growing international outrage over the paralysis of the Council to deliver fully on its mandate. Palestinians in Gaza have been pushed from the north to the very south of the Strip, forcibly displaced many times over, killed and injured in the process, and with no means of escape. They have now been cornered in Rafah, faced with the impossible choice of a forced transfer outside of Gaza or becoming the targets of the instruments of war. The Council has to stand up now for Gaza. Colleagues, we know the conditions in Gaza. We have heard more about this morning. We know that the population is starving and suffering in the cold. We know how women and children are disproportionately affected by this senseless war. We know that the healthcare system has broken down, with essential medical supplies not allowed in at scale, and hospitals the targets of military operations. Humanitarian supplies into Gaza are subject to slow and stringent verification processes with only a trickle of aid entering the Strip. Desperation among the population is therefore high. As we think about Gaza, we are deeply concerned whenever we consider the psychological trauma on top of everything else that people are experiencing. We think of the children. Each time we meet here to discuss Gaza, we hear of misery on top of misery on top of misery. What else needs to happen before we are compelled to end this misery for the people in Gaza? Guyana also acknowledges with sadness the many UN and other humanitarian personnel whose lives have been lost in the war. We also recognize those who continue to give selfless service under these extremely difficult conditions and stress that their safety and security should be equally concerning to us as a council. The funding cuts to UNRWA are also having a detrimental impact, given the critical work of the agency both in Gaza and in the West Bank. For us, these cuts are tantamount to collective punishment for the Palestinian people. Guyana appeals for the restoration of funding for UNRWA and for other donors to scale up funding to the agency. We have made our own contribution just recently. The events in Gaza are having a tremendous impact on an already volatile region, creating legitimate concerns about a regional conflagration. Guyana calls on all parties to exercise restraint and to refrain from actions that would only further exacerbate the situation in the region. The Security Council's actions must match the level of urgency. People are depending on us to stay alive. We need to send a strong and unequivocal message that this Council does not support the violations of international law taking place in Gaza. Colleagues, Guyana urges this Council to safeguard the rights and dignity of the Palestinian people, in particular their right to a state of their own and to live in peace and security away from the shadows of war. I resume my function as President of the Council. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. I now invite Council members to informal consultations to continue our discussion on the subject. The meeting is adjourned.